I think, ready to dive into one of your favorite characters in all of sports, Deion Sanders. So I'll let you take it from here.
What's not to like about Deion Sanders, quite honestly? Although there is something, John, because I saw this little note out and nobody was really paying attention to it that I could see. There is a flood of guys that are starting to leave Colorado's football program since the start of April. And it's been 14 players. One of them's a 4-star. He's a cornerback. And then you've got 13 other players that are at least 3 stars or higher that are all leaving the program. Now, why is that? You know, we all heard about all this great stuff and what Deion's doing there. And I'm a fan. I think Deion's just a wonderful guy and does a lot of things right. Some things wrong. I didn't like what happened last year at Oregon, but that's a different story when they're walking onto the field and wiping their feet on the Oregon Duck and all the rest of that, John, after he was just mad about what had happened with Nebraska at his own stadium. So that sometimes comes back to bite you. But that being said, I still love the guy. I love what he wants to do with players and do things right. I will say this, though, John. They won those first 3 games last year, right? Everybody was excited. Everybody's on the bandwagon. The Rock and all those guys who want to jump on the bandwagon, they were all on there. They were hanging on for dear life and loving it, right? Well, then they lost 8 of the next 9. And suddenly the Rock and everybody is not showing up over there for these games anymore as they're getting beat up. So it's just curious to me to see how many of these guys are leaving. I find it odd. It feels like a little bit of a jailbreak. Why are these guys all leaving? A lot of younger players that are wanting to go somewhere else. And we don't know what playing time looks like, but there was certainly an exodus of that. So I find it kind of interesting. And by the way, one more guy today left, and it's a running back that was the rookie of the year in the AAC, you're running back out of the University of Houston, John. So you've probably even seen him play, Alton McCaskill. So I'm curious. I want to throw out to you, what in the world is going on? First of all, I'm of the camp where if you leave a team, you should have the right reasons on why you're leaving. Or are you just leaving because you're not the starter yet and all the rest of that, right? I mean, you got to put in your time. And I don't know what the reasoning is behind this, but they certainly have lost a decent number of guys to the portal. And I find it a little bit alarming because it's by far one of the biggest of anybody in the portal right now, despite the fact that they also have signed some of the best numbers when it comes from guys from the portal as well. So they're still in the top 10 when it comes to the signing players out of there and their stars and all the rest of it, but they're not able to retain them. What do you think is going on?
Well, I think what it is, Pete, is that you've got players that look at the roster, and if a couple big linebackers signed with Colorado and I was at Colorado, even if I had transferred in and all of a sudden I look at a couple beasts that just transferred in, I might have second thoughts about whether or not I'm going to play. And the nice thing about the portal is that it works just like you and I talked about, supply and demand. So if, like it happened last year when Deion first got there, if you get there and the talent on the team isn't as deep, well, you're going to get a lot of players leaving because Deion told them to. He said, yeah, you don't think you can play here? Go. But now that you've got a bunch of players in and a bunch of new ones coming in as well, what if you are a pretty fair assessor of your own talent and you say, I don't know if I'm going to play with these new guys coming in. The coach is drooling all over him and he hasn't said crap to me lately. Well, more or less a quote I heard from Deion, Pete, was this: I pray to God that these players go to a program that challenges them and holds them accountable and develops them as young men. Unfortunately, we weren't the program that could accomplish it. So go get it, man. Because if you've got talent and you want to develop it, go find a place that'll do it better than we can. And, you know, it's not really as much of a backhanded, you know, hey, don't let the door hit you on the way out. But I think he's being real with these players, Pete, because you and I know, you know, some players would say to Ohio State or Oklahoma or Texas, hey, I'll transfer, but how much are you going to pay me?
Yeah.
And that really rubbed a lot of these coaches, including Nick Saban, the wrong way. And he's like, well, if you don't want to be here, don't be here. We'll talk about your money if you're a big star and all that kind of stuff. But if you ain't a big star and you can't even crack the starting lineup, maybe you should be somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Well, it's an interesting thing. And I was a little bit surprised to see that many jumping into the portal to get out, basically, saying, all right, we're out of here. We'll see you next time. And that whole thing. Very, very interesting. All right, John, how about this? Let's do a little quick mock draft. We're only going to do the top 5. So I think that most everybody has it pretty close to right, except for the last one. So I've got Caleb Williams going to the Bears. Now, this is not who I think is the right pick. It's who I think is going where.
Yeah.
I think Caleb goes to Chicago. I think Jaden Daniels goes to Washington. I think Drake May goes to New England. I think they're looking for that big kind of stiffer type quarterback, and that's what they'd be getting out of Drake May from North Carolina. I think Marvin Harrison makes sense for Arizona because they want to get as much talent on the field as they can for their quarterback, and they want to get it in a wide receiver, and he's the biggest and extremely fast, amazing guy. He's got great lineage. He's awesome. Here's where I differ from everybody else, though. The LA Chargers, all right? Now, hear me out on this one. Who's their coach? Guy by the name of Jim Harbaugh, right? Mm-hmm. So he's got a quarterback who's pretty damn good in Justin Herbert. And I think that if you can give him just a little bit more time, you've got a guy who can probably thread the needle pretty well. And that team, I think, could turn pretty rapidly. So I'm going to say Joe Alt. Now, that's the son of John Alt. You and I have talked about him before. I'm happy to say he's going to join me on Sunday, John, on our Sports Huddle program. And we're going to talk about what's it like to be a guy who's somewhere in the top 5, 6, 7 picks in the draft. What's it like? What have you been doing? How you been doing that? He's got a great tutor in front of him, though. His father at 6'9", 340, and he's 6'9" and 330 pounds. I think he's got the right guy kind of helping him out along the way, John. And he was just talking to me the other day. They were both working out together. They were working on all their drills and everything. And it's just phenomenal how much in the family it is and how much this guy looks like John, plays like John. Just a wonderful young man that used to be a quarterback until his dad said, hey, look, there ain't too many quarterbacks 6'9", 300 plus pounds out there. So I think you're going to be an offensive tackle. Anyway, do you have a similar top 5, or did you have Joe maybe not in the top? A lot of people have him going to Tennessee later on too, like 6 or 7.
Yeah, that's where I have him going, Pete. As far as raw talent and ability to be an impact player, definitely Joe Alt is that guy. There's no doubt about that, in my opinion. But I think a lot of these teams, including even Harbaugh, Pete, even though, as you've said many times, he loves his tight ends, he's got one of the best young quarterbacks that has developed, but he hasn't had the kind of receivers that he needs. And so I don't know if that's Odunze, from Washington, or Malik Neighbors from LSU, or who it is. But I think one of those 2 wide receivers, Pete, one of those 2 top picks at wide receivers, either, LSU, you could take your pick of either of those 2 guys, or Odunze it's Rome Odunze, I think, over at Washington. That kid is a beast. 92 catches, Pete, 1,600 plus yards for the season, 13 TDs. He looked great against Michigan. And if only things could have broken a little bit more one way, I think Washington could have won that thing, because certainly they had the talent, and he is one of the reasons they had that talent. So I'd say either of those 2 wideouts, Pete, I think are who Harbaugh takes for his quarterback. But if he doesn't, the quarterback would love having a big stud like Joe Alt right up there in front of him, keeping guys off him on the blind side.
He'll be sitting there for about 8 or 10 years on that left side if they draft him, John. And the only reason I'm going against the grain of everybody else, because you and a lot of other people, I think you're right. You need a receiver. You always need a receiver. My only issue is I think it's so deep this year with receivers. You can go all the way into second, maybe even the 3rd round with receivers. You're still going to get a great one. I mean, this is a really deep draft with great speed, size, all that type of thing. And I think those receivers are a little bit easier to find, and maybe they are next year as well. But There's only a Joe Alter here or so every couple of maybe 5 or 10 years. A guy comes out with that kind of athleticism, I think. So that's why I kind of put him up there. Now, likelihood that it's a receiver, probably about 90%, but I'm going against that. And that's why I'm throwing Joe Alt in there.
Well, that, like you said, that kid, barring injury, because we never know, that kid should play for a decade or more. And his dad's on the Ring of Fame at the Kansas City Stadium. So I think this kid's got that same pedigree.